Alright, today we're doing a video on how to fill your pieces as you modify cubes and really any kind of plastic toy you want. We're looking at fill material. So we got a lot of supplies here. The answer, if you're looking for just a quick answer, the answer is already you get Apoxie Sculpt. This is for the cost. This is the best value in terms of how solid it becomes, how easy it is to modify when it is solid, how easy it is to use when it's not solid or cured yet while it's still malleable, and just the applications. This is the best option that you're going to have, Apoxie Sculpt. Next, we're also going to look at some resin casting, which does have some really great uses, although it is a little limited, being entirely liquid. And for you at home, I'm aware that maybe you don't have all these crafting or building supplies on hand. So we're also going to look at some different options like repurposing material as filler and even a paper fill option. First things first, I'm going to show off. This is a piece that we've already filled and modified. The back of it was open because in the cutting process, when I was taking the face off, it popped the other half of this piece off and launched it out into the garden somewhere. Don't know where it's at. So Apoxie Sculpt, filled this in, tried to keep it a nice little flat shape, and I'll be sanding that off later with a flat file like this. You need something flat and sturdy and solid because you also want your piece to be flat and sturdy and solid. And while I can get the top of this, the part that faces outwards, I can get that on a belt sander and just sand it down nice and flat. It's this underside with the little foot attached that I cannot use a belt sander on. So I need a flat file like this, or even a small, more craft base flat file like I have these. Getting started, let's look at what makes Apoxie Sculpt such a good option. I'm not actually sponsored by these, I've just used them for a lot of crafts and stuff. This is Apoxie Sculpt. This is a white version, which just means when it's all cured, when it's all solid, it looks white. And I use this for my sculptures because if I need to paint over them, white paint doesn't stick very well in general, so you have to use a lot of it. And if the base is already white, then I use less paint. It's a win-win. But for the Rubik's mods, I have these big tubs of the black Apoxie Sculpt because you got black plastic, black epoxy, just makes sense. What you do when you're going to be modifying with Apoxie Sculpt is you pinch out couple little pieces. Try to keep them about the same size. I need more of the part B compound. Not quite there yet. Pinch a little more. It is a little forgiving. You don't need a gram scale or anything so specific. You do have a little wiggle room, but try to get it as close as possible. Once you have two equally sized pieces, you combine them, press it, mush it. You can see it's already getting all over my hands, which is why I have these gloves on specifically for this and all the other messy materials we're working with today. So I encourage you to wear some kind of protection on your hands and clothes if you'll be doing this as well. Once you've had time to blend it all together, it should be one consistent, solid, uniform color with no streaks or noticeable variances in color. Just make sure it's all the same. And then you can just start stuffing. This is a piece from the cubic Mega Minx that I'm building, and I'm just gonna start stuffing it in there. Make sure you press it in good. You don't want air bubbles and stuff, just in general. If you haven't cut yet, or if you're working in an application that is going to need heat, you do not want air bubbles because both of those will mess up what you're working with. Air is empty space. It'll either expand when it gets too hot, or it'll just explode And if you have not finished making all your cuts yet and you run into an air bubble, you could potentially have your cutting tool get out of hand. After it hits the air bubble, it'll hit a pocket where all of a sudden there's nothing where there should be something, and it'll be messy. No fun. So just be thorough with your Apoxie Sculpt. One of these had a partial pack. There we go. I'm just gonna finish filling the top of this guy. I'm gonna take a little pinch off the bottom here to show you another great little feature about working with Apoxie Sculpt. Now, Apoxie Sculpt is water soluble, meaning you can clean it up with water as long as it's not cured yet, it's not solid. So while you're working with this, it's good to have a little sponge or a cup with water that you can use to keep the epoxy wet. What I've got here is a little sponge. It's got that popular Scotch Brite pad on the bottom that works as a good finishing buff when you're all done. And I've just added a little water into the center. And what you can do with a piece in general is just barely dab it on there, and then you can kind of rub it flat. Now I've already got a flatter surface. It's a little unnecessary for this step, but it is really good for another lead-in to our resin casting video. Let's look at this. There used to be a little seam right at this location where you could separate these two pieces of plastic. Hold on one second. Okay, so we have this piece here. Let me grab my little metal tool. I'm going to pop open the part we're talking about. See? Again, we have these little two-piece separations so it can be hollow and easily produced, but the issue is, in order to more easily clean this and modify it and all those things, the manufacturing company leaves a little gap. I got a little hole right here, and if I try and pour something liquid like a resin into the top, it's all just going to dribble out the bottom of this and just be awful. So instead, what we're going to do is patch this just real quick with the tiniest little bit of Apoxie Sculpt, because a tiny bit goes a long way when we just need to fill this one little seam. And this is where the water sponge is extremely helpful. I'm going to take this, push just a little bit into it, so epoxy's in the seam, dab it on the sponge, and then just run it flat on this index card or another hard surface that you protected. And just like that, the entire surface of this Apoxie Sculpt is completely sealed, so now we can pour resin inside of it effectively, and the index card we can just keep reusing. The water let the Apoxie Sculpt be rubbed flat on another surface without sticking. Because if I try to do the same thing, let's just do finger Apoxie Sculpt, look at that, it's a mess. It does not want to cooperate. So instead, a little water means everybody has a good time working with Apoxie Sculpt. This is the same, this is true for all Apoxie Sculpt applications. If you want to sculpt with it or do other things, just keep a little sponge or a cup of water that you can wet your tools on, and then you can better shape it so it doesn't get sticky and pulled everywhere. With that, we're going to start looking at the second option for filling pieces like this for cube modding is resin. I'll give the exact brand of resin in the description. I don't have it on hand. And we have a part A and a part B. To use resin, you have to follow two directions. One is use the correct ratio. It's very common for resins to be 50% and 50%, and it'll get solid plastic, it'll cure. But some resins get a little fancier and you need to use more precise methods of measurement to achieve specific ratios like 10 parts to 1 part, yada yada. Following the instructions on the ratio. The second step is to not get it everywhere. If you can follow that, you're pretty much set. I have these 2 cups. Normally you'll see people use 3 cups, a cup for the B side, a cup for the A side, and then a 3rd cup to mix it in, but that's a little wasteful. So what I'll be doing instead is I'll pour some of part A into this cup, some of part B into this cup, and then once they're stirred, I'll just pour this one into this one, stir it, and then pour it back into this cup. So the complete 50-50 solution will be in both cups at one point or another, and this means both cups will eventually end up with a little layer of solid plastic at the bottom like this. And that's good, because the alternative would be one of the cups would only have a partial compound, and then it gets sticky and it gets gummy and I have to throw the cup away. If I do combine both catalysts in both cups, then both cups will be inert. Both cups will be inert, and neither cup will be left over with gummy, sticky residue. So they'll both start slowly filling up with plastic as I work with these more and more, but that's fine, they're just little plastic shot glasses. One of the reasons we're using tiny little cups like this, one, they're transparent, so we can see how much resin we've filled with, and that way we can see if we've hit that 50-50 ratio. The second reason I'm using little cups is because as you pour into one of these, some of it's going to get stuck on the sides, right? It doesn't all just slide right out. Some of it will get stuck on the sides, which means the longer the cup is, the taller it is, then the more of it would be stuck on the sides, and I have to use more resin and more will get wasted. So the smaller your cup, the less waste you produce all around. The other thing we're going to be doing with our resin casting step for today is I have a little ball of polymer clay here. This is Sculpey brand specifically, but you can use any kind of putty like silly putty, Play-Doh, Fimo, modeling clay, anything you want. You can use anything that's putty or clay or moldable material based for this step. All we're doing is we're getting a little base that we can squish onto the piece and then squish onto the table to keep it flat when we pour the resin in. We don't want these going anywhere, and this particular resin takes about 5 to 10 minutes to cure to go solid, assuming that the ratio was followed correctly. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes. So in the meantime, I don't want to be holding each of these upright for 5 to 10 minutes at a time, so I'm going to be adding a little base so they can stand upright on their own and not go anywhere. Alright, we got the resin pieces, or the pieces to be filled with resin. We have them lined up here with a putty base. Now we're going to be pouring some resin into these little cups, going for the 50-50 mix. So I'm going to hold this up where I can see it, and also you. A little, how's that looking? That should be enough, but what the heck, we'll go a little extra than we need, just in case. Maybe a little extra more. And I'm grabbing a paper towel right now because with resin it's easier to clean up preemptively. Even if this would never spill on the ground, I don't want to give it the chance to. If I make a mess out of this, that one's on me. So lids is on tightly again. Already cleaned up, wiped off my hands from contact with the bottle. All this stuff. Don't want this goo on me. And we're opening the second bottle. This is our part B. And now I need to kind of compare the two side by side. And there we go. Okay. Same thing. Get this cleaned up immediately. Resin is very messy, and it can be time consuming, and it can be expensive, but it is very helpful and very reliable for things like casting, making duplicates of things. Obviously, as a liquid you can get perfect detail, but also as a liquid I can fill up these whole cavities, which would take a lot of Apoxie Sculpt and would take a lot of time with Apoxie Sculpt. So instead I'm just going to go quick and easy and just pour some resin into these, because the amount of liquid volume doesn't really feel as impactful as the amount of liquid or is the amount of volume that we would need from Apoxie Sculpt. So next goal here is to make sure I'm scraping the sides and the top and the bottom, just completely mixing this up as much as possible. And this will now turn into a hard, solid plastic very soon. And like we said earlier, I'm going to reintroduce it to this container as well, which means we can reuse both cups later and I don't need to throw any away. Okay, scrape this off. This is why we have wax paper underneath, and just one by one. Ooh. I did run a test on a piece like this, and while there is slight expansion from the resin as it cures, it does get a little bigger, but not so much that it would break our pieces. Okay, these are all filled. I'm going to give them just a little extra. Again, we can always sand if we need to, but going back in and refilling is a pain in the booty. Okay. Oop, there he goes. That one's dripping. Fortunately, plastic on plastic resin, depending on the brand of course, but plastic on plastic resin is pretty easy to just scrape away with the razor. So I'm not too concerned about the spill at this point because we have our little protective surface underneath. This will cure probably in about 5 minutes from now, so I'm just going to cut to that part in the video, and then we're going to look at options that you can use as replacement or alternative to filler that you should have at home already. Alright, that's all set. I'm just going to leave them here for the time being because I just want to make sure they've been given a chance to completely cure and go completely solid before I start moving them around. Plus it gives you a nice little focus for the center of the table while we continue. You'll notice I don't have any more empty pieces on the table, and that's because I'm using professional supplies and I would like to get professional results. So while I'm going to show you how to create your own fillers at home, I'm not adding them to any of my supplies for this current project. I'm a little too invested in it. The first option is you can use a cheap existing filling material that you have at home. Like in this case I have a styrofoam cup. I could easily trim out a nice little piece of styrofoam, right? I could trim this out and then start feeding it into the hole I need and just pack it as full as it'll get. Once the styrofoam is in the piece, then you can use just some glue you have lying around the house and fill the extra space around the styrofoam. Leave it out, probably overnight should do the trick if you're using that much Elmer's glue. Just leave it out for a few hours, it'll dry, and you'll have a hard solid surface that didn't take too much glue because you filled it ahead of time with styrofoam. I'm gonna go keep this out of the ocean, put that somewhere here. The next step that everybody should absolutely have at home is some paper. I've seen people chew up newspapers and make chess pieces out of it, so if you have absolutely nothing else, you can get away with a cheap little paper option. You get a little paper. I'm going to add a little water to the mix here. Well, first I'm going to take the paper out. It's better to mix your glue solution first and then introduce the paper. It's just easier that way. You don't even need glue. You can just do paper and water and just mush it up as well as you can into just a paste and just stuff it in whatever you need to stuff it. It's not pretty, but it'll get the job done. So here I've got a little glue, a little water, a little more water. The trick with this, you can follow recipes or something for paper mache, but I'm using just enough water so that the glue gets nice and runny. I'm not trying to substitute this with water. There we go. Just keep gluing it up. This is probably going to be about 50-50, or maybe we'll do a 2-to-1 ratio where it's twice as much glue for the amount of water we use. Somewhere in between there. That's the happy zone for this. And I got a second popsicle stick that's not covered in plastic. Woo! We got a leaper. Well, that's good enough. It doesn't need to be blended super fine because we're about to mush in all the little paper that we tore up ahead of time. Just get this paste everywhere. You can see the effectiveness of the Nameless paper towel brand that I'm using. It's now extremely malleable, basically liquid. This paper is gonna take whatever shape you need it to at this point, and the water and the glue added to it will give it a little extra rigidity that may even allow you to sand it. You can certainly paint it when this is dry, and it'll hold its shape well enough to at least to hold its shape. It may not be very durable in the long term, but if you really need an instant fill material here at home, everybody's got paper. Everybody's got water or spit if you gotta go full-on newspaper chess pieces like we were talking about earlier. So that is the tutorial on filling. Again, if you plan on doing any more than a single project, your best bet is just to go out and get some Apoxie Sculpt. It is 2 parts and they sell together. This is a huge 4-pound tub because I plan on doing a lot of modifications, but for regular sculpting that I do as well, I've had this exact set, this little set of the 2 for like 3 years and I'm still not done with it. So it's for sure a great investment, and it'll give you much better results that you can be much happier with. Let's add a couple pro tips here. Let's say you got your Apoxie Sculpt part A, you got your Apoxie Sculpt part B, and you don't really know how to get them even. A real quick trick: take 2 disposable spoons. Do not use spoons you're going to be eating with because, first of all, that's gross, and 2, you could really hurt yourself if you ingest this stuff. It's not food. So get 2 disposable spoons. You can always rewash these and reuse these. It's preferable if you do, but you can use the spoon to get the same amount of Apoxie Sculpt out of each container. Obviously you're going to want to do this for bigger projects where you need a lot of Apoxie Sculpt at once, but you could chew out a little piece there, flatten it into the spoon, and then shave off the excess from the top with something like a straight edge razor blade. Took us a couple seconds, not too long, and then just repeat the process with the other part of the compound. Once you do that, you know you've got the same amount because these spoons hold the same amount, and that's an easy way to measure it. Likewise, they're not super expensive, but these aren't very common to just have lying around the house, is little pipettes like this, especially graduated ones that tell you how much fluid is in the pipette at once. I definitely recommend getting a set of these if you're going to be doing much resin work, because these allow you to quickly, cleanly, and very accurately determine how much resin you'll be using, and it's extremely helpful to make sure your casts come out cleanly. In the video, the resin cures almost instantly. It was a very fast cure, which means we had almost the perfect amount of compound A to compound B. So the chemical catalyzation process was able to occur quickly and effectively. But if you have more of one side or more of the other, it's going to get kind of gummy, kind of rubbery maybe, kind of sticky, and it's just a mess. You know how hard it is to clean that stuff out? It's a nightmare. So these options can help you measure your compounds more effectively. Thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, maybe even hit the alert button if you feel like it. I've got more videos coming out, more modifications in the way, along with other art videos that you can follow along with to better express yourself. Thanks again. This has been Souffle Art.